Well, kia ora and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. And welcome to the PTGA's Polar Panel 5 session here. This afternoon, this evening, this morning, we're going to be having a chat about leadership, teams, and safety management. So a grunty couple of topics here, and certainly a lot of content to get through. So thanks a lot for tuning in here. The first disclaimer of the evening, as some of you will have already noticed, I speak a strong Kiwi type of English, and we don't have the ability to do subtitles just yet, so you'll just have to see what you can do along the way. Google Translate is quite useful if you need to. Graham Charles is on the panel. He's a Kiwi, but he speaks American, so he'll be able to offer any insights along the way. So thanks a lot for joining us here. For those, the astute observers will notice that we're only 3 panelists plus myself. We had a late notice from Hadley this evening that he was unable to join us, but what that does allow us is some more time with the talented team in front of us here. If you're tuning in for the first time, I'd like to just add a little bit about the PTGA. So they're kind of the driver behind this polar panel session, and it's a really cool opportunity for us to kind of share information and ideas and experience, from key players in the industry, for those of us who work in the industry, and certainly for those of us who are looking at joining the industry. So if you haven't heard of them, the Polar Tourism Guides Association, the PTGA as we call it, are a not-for-profit member-based organization. They are ISO accredited with a testing system, and this is kind of spans 22 different skill areas that are specifically suited for the polar regions and expedition cruising. So if you head over to the website, and we'll list that a little bit later on, then you can find out a little bit more about it. And we're actually lucky to have a couple of the head honchos from the PTGA joining us today as well. As we progress through the session here, you'll have the ability to use the comments session or section there. So if you do have any questions you'd like me to ask the esteemed panelists here, then certainly don't hesitate in sending them through. We do have a limited amount of time today, so I already know in advance we won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll certainly do what we can. So do take some time if you have some questions, and we'll see if we can address them. A little bit about me. My name's Ben Jackson, and I work as a polar guide and expedition leader. I'm a co-founder of the Expedition Guide Academy, and then I also work as a senior assessor for the Polar Tourism Guides Association. So many hats there, and I'm super excited to have the opportunity to sit down virtually with the team that we have here today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the proverbial mic over to Nikki, and she's going to tell us a little bit about who and where she is. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm Nikki Trudeau. I'm here in Toronto. I'm Canadian. Very fortunately, my background is in education, and I began my polar career in education with youth in the polar regions. More recently, and with Quark Expeditions, I've worked as a guide and an expedition coordinator, an expedition leader, and in the last year took on a new role, which is Director of Expedition Team Engagement and Development, where myself and our team oversee our recruitment, our staffing, scheduling, and our internal training and development of the Quark Expedition team, which is over 200 strong at this point. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm really stoked to be a part of it with you guys.
Cool, thanks, Nikki. We're super psyched to have you here with us today. Fellow Canadian, Mr. Brandon Harvey, welcome.
Well, thank you. Yes, also from Canada, from the West Coast, currently living in Edmonton, Alberta. I've been a part of the polar tourism industry since about 2003 as a plucky young Zodiac driver, and fell in love from day one, and have since been a guide and an expedition leader. And in more recent years, moved into the administrative side of things in the office, Director of Expedition Operations for Polar Latitudes for a few years, and now I'm with EOS Expeditions in the same role, or same title. Yeah, I'm very excited. I've been part of PTGA from the early days, and also one of the board of director members of PTGA.
Great. Thanks, Brando. There's been a little bit of movement behind the scenes with the PTGA and the board of directors. Are you able to kind of give us a little bit more information on that?
Yeah, for sure. We have had some changes in the board of directors, and this is the overall kind of structure of the organization. This is a result of just the overall growth and potential that this organization has within the industry. Obviously, lots of new hardware being ordered despite the current state of affairs in the world of COVID. I think the long-term outlook for our industry is quite strong still, and we've realized that taking better advantage of all the different talent that's in our ranks and volunteering their time and expertise was required. So kind of broadening our voice and getting more formal structure behind kind of how we organize ourselves internally.
Cool. Okay, thanks for that, Brando. It's always nice to have a little bit of insight in the behind the scenes. And looking very much behind the scenes, it's our opportunity to join with us, Mr. Graham Charles. How you doing, Graham?
Kia ora, Ben. Kia ora, other panelists and everybody else. My name's Graham. For any PTGA members, you would have probably emailed or dealt with me at some stage through the PTGA channels. I am a Kiwi, but I live between New Zealand and Bozeman, Montana, in the USA, where I am currently, hence the sunshine outside. I've been involved in teaching and leadership and outdoor education for all of my adult and even sub-adult career, and working in the polar, or adventuring in the polar regions, or working in the polar regions since the late 90s, and more in the expedition industry, whether it's small boats or film safety or expedition support or expeditions, since the early 2000s. I'm the president of the Polar Tourism Guides Association, as Brando alluded to. I fulfill an administration and day-to-day monitoring role with the association, with our admin person Pascal, who many of you would have had contact with, and as Brandon alluded to, the PTGA is definitely governed and run by a board of directors who sit at the top of our chain of command, and then myself and Pascal work behind the scenes on the day-to-day stuff, your recognition of current competencies, and keeping things going with all the systems that we do need, which is a lot these days.
Great, thanks, Graham. So this is actually a great opportunity for me and the panelists and the rest of the team. You are the inception of the PTGA and have dealt with a lot of communications over the time. What are the common misconceptions you see about the Polar Tourism Guides Association?
There's a good number of those. A lot of people they'll see an association like ours and make up their own mind about what it is, either through some discussion or some a misunderstanding that somebody else had. Through our time since our existence in late 2016, when we first registered as a federal non-profit in the US, there's been a lot of misunderstandings. Probably number one, I think, that I get emails and comments about is that the PTGA is going to be or wants to be a union for the polar tourism industry or expedition cruising, which is it's impossible. The way we're set up federally and legally, we just can't do that. And so, that's a myth we're definitely keen for people to move on from. The other one is just through sheer numbers that we are an association for Antarctic Peninsula polar guides, just because even if you look at it, the relative numbers there are more people involved in the job or profession of polar guiding on the Antarctic Peninsula, and we service those people, but we service those people as much as we service guides in Svalbard. If people want to join us from Greenland, or any other part of the polar realm, then that's our role. And so we're not just an Antarctic Peninsula guiding association. Also, that probably number three on that list that I get questions about is people think because we are a standards and assessment body, that's our primary focus, that unless you're doing an assessment, there's nothing for you. But people only need to look around of what they can gain from the PTGA, these sorts of things, the growing number of resources on our website for members to help them be a better guide and to develop in the profession of guiding, whether it's polar guiding or expedition guiding. And so we offer an awful lot more than just assessment.
Okay, great. And then anything about, I've often heard some talk, through the industry about the syllabi or syllabus and how that's all set up. Any comments before we get into the leadership side of things?
Our syllabi were designed, well, not designed, our syllabi were curated by a lot of very experienced polar experts. So they weren't something that was cooked up in an isolated basement. We put them out there and they are an example of industry best practice. There is no way that the PTGA says that this is the standard. We don't have that. We don't have that charter. We don't have that ability in the industry. We are an option for people to use. And our syllabi, what are called a criterion reference syllabi, which means that they provide some guidance to assessors who are trained to use these syllabi to make judgments about how people perform to a certain level of competency in some things. We don't, at PTGA, and we'll get onto this with situational management and awareness later on, we don't, these things are not fixed in stone. They're open to interpretation because we believe that that is the foundation of what our decision making in the polar tourism industry needs to be, that a set syllabus and a set way to do things is not the answer for us.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for that, Graham, and thanks, Brando, as well, for just adding a little bit more behind the scenes for what goes on with life with the PTGA. If you do have any questions about that for all of our viewers, then certainly don't hesitate in sending them through. We have Lauren, who's working away behind the scenes. I'd like to just say thanks to her. She's been a key person in making all of this happen as well. So don't hesitate in sending that stuff through to Lauren. Okay, so brief overview here for the session. We're going to look at leadership in teams, or what we might call membership sometimes. And then what we'll look at doing a little bit later on in the piece is we'll talk about some safety management within expedition operations. So to get the ball rolling under the leadership side of things, I'm keen to hear from our panelists a brief story about leadership in the polar tourism industry that you think has been done well, that you've observed, or even something that's been done poorly that we might be able to learn from. Brando, do you want to get the ball rolling with us on that one?
Sure. I guess, in absence in the early days of real structured team building or even skills development, often we'd have hotel team members joining us and driving Zodiacs, and there's no real function there to assess skills. The same goes with leadership, and often we'd have people that were put in leadership roles that maybe were there just because of overall time served or knowledge of an area. And I think more and more we've seen with guiding around the world in different genres that there is a set amount of skill that goes into being a good leader. And I guess I go from examples where I've seen of poor leadership being those leaders where they think it's a top-down approach, that it's about power, it's about being a single representative for the entire product, not trusting those within their team and their command. So for me, I guess it's more about what can be done poorly as a leader versus what can be done properly. There's a variety of ways to be a good leader, but there's even smaller amounts of ways to be a poor leader. It's yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brando. And I think we'll try and explore some of these options as we move through here. Nikki, you've got a lot of experience in the polar tourism industry. You must have seen some great examples of good leadership, or perhaps leadership that could be done better. anything you care to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Brandon has said. That's definitely hit the nail on the head. But I know that the forms of leadership that have resonated with me, or maybe moments, or moments that I can imagine, are moments where the leader actually wasn't a parent as the leader. They stepped back and they empowered other people. They moved into even a different physical space on a landing site, or allowed for a team member who has a lot of experience to step up and have autonomy. I honestly, there's a lot of examples that I can think of in recent years, and that I kind of call upon in those moments, that I recognize my own growth as a leader as a result of the autonomy that they provided. So trust is really big. Authenticity in terms of their communication with me or with the team. And there are several people that I can think about that are currently in the field and that I've worked with in the past, and moments there. And in terms of, it's true that negative, or rather maybe negative examples sometimes are easier to pick out, and we decide, oh, I don't like that, that didn't feel great. Maybe I want to do it differently, or I'd seek being a part of a team with a different leadership style. And I think one that is part of the evolution really of the industry is that shift from the leaders being so fully focused on the operations only, and maybe less so with the interpersonal skills or the communication skills or the care really that they're putting into the team. And so I think sometimes if we focus a leader or a position on a natural progression of their career because the amount of time that they've had or their operational experience, well, that's obviously essential in the places that we work to be safe and to provide a great experience. I think that those who don't lead well are the ones that lean really heavily towards the operational side, focus almost solely on that, and don't focus on that interpersonal part of it and the part of building people up and creating a place for people to thrive.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, it is very easy for us, when we're working in teams and particularly under other leaders, to see, times where we don't think the leadership has been done well, but that's always, has to be taken with a grain of salt because you don't have all of the pressure and all of the responsibility. So yeah, I think that's a valid point. Graham, you must have a few tall tales that you could tell us.
Have many tall tales. For me, I would turn the question around. I think Brandon alluded to it. I think the leadership that is now being shown across the industry, of course, in making these comments, they're gross generalizations, but hey, we're a panel of 4, and we're able to do that. My general perception of the industry from when I first started out on it, that the idea of leadership was not something that was discussed. People knew to talk about it as an actual thing, a skill, like driving a Zodiac as well as Brandon does, or doing other things as well as Nikki does, was not something that people talked about. And in the last 20 years, it's quite amazing, I think, that now we're even having this discussion, that there are companies out there now that are looking at training and developing staff in leadership as much as they are in leading hikes or interpretation and other things like that. And so I think that's an example of development and leadership through this industry, which has been really good. Let me give you a metaphor from, I was doing some training with a young guide one time on Deception Island, and it was leading a hike, and I was assessing them, and this young person was leading their hike, and they were in the front the whole time, leading the hike, because that, in their narrow or less experienced perception of leadership, was where you lead a hike from. You must be in front. And then I questioned this person on why you must lead from the front. And their only response was, well, because, I mean, you look like a leader, it's where you're supposed to be, and all of that kind of stuff. And then we started talking about contingency leadership. and what it means to actually look at the situation you have, look at the resource you have, and look at the decisions you have to make, and then decide where a leader sits. And leadership is an influence process. And it's not solely set on your personal power, or even worse, your positional power, which historically, my perception of this industry is that people were promoted to positional power with no ability to be inducted or trained in what actual leadership for that role, which was called expedition leader, was about. Back to our hike, this person, once we talked about different strategies to lead from the tail of the group or to inject yourself in the middle of the group, the metaphor when we talked about expedition leaders this person had met, some who were very good and some who were less competent, they could see that leadership didn't have to be from the front. It could be in the middle just as well as it could be from the rear of a group.
Okay, thanks, Graham. You've talked about the focus on leadership development becoming more prevalent or more of a focus for companies. So what's changed? Why are companies investing in this more? Nikki, this is probably a good question for you because this is something that you work a lot with. What's changed? Why the focus now?
Yeah, I think the way that maybe historically, for all of time, we've known that people have like the stuff of good leadership. But maybe it's only been recently that we dive into or analyze and understand where that comes from, what experiences and what qualities, what intentions is that person setting, how are they going about their activities, in order to be an effective leader. And that, like for us within Quark, has really been something that we've only started talking about formally within the last maybe 5 years, as it's been woven into our training curriculum. And really, like we are all, as guides, we're all leaders. It's the process by which we're guiding. So it's an essential part to understand with intention how to be an effective leader, either on a small scale in your boat or on a hike, or on a larger scale overseeing a whole expedition. So I think it's a combination of that. We understand more about it. We understand what's happening in our brains and our development and our behavior. And in understanding that and having more access to resources like podcasts or manuals or discussions or workshops, we can all acknowledge and relate to it. We start speaking the same language. We can be more intentional with those skills. It's not passive. It's not just something that someone happens to have. We can all think critically about how we lead ourselves and how we lead others, how we lead within a group, and apply that. And so it's almost like guiding and leadership are inextricable. They're one and the same. And as we learn more about leadership, we have to continue to weave that into what we do in our profession.
Can I add to that? I also think in that development, early days of the industry, it was about the hardware and what you did and all of that sort of stuff. And I definitely see, as Nikki said, over the last 5 years, that companies are looking to, let's face it, polar tourism companies are not an educational outfit. They're not a philanthropic organization just for human betterment of their staff. They're there to make money and to look after the places that we go to. And because of that, it's a natural maturity and tendency to decide how can we be better? How does this company get better? And so, there's only so many things you can do with 12 black zodiacs and the staff that you have and the penguins that you have, or polar bears in the north. And it's a natural maturity that the industry has gone towards. How do we now develop the human capital that we have? That means people, to be better at this job and provide our guests with a better experience, provide our staff with better leadership so that there's less conflict, there's less problems, there's less turmoil within the team. And it's a natural progression, just like it was the time that the PTGA came into formation. It was kind of the time, and I feel that this discussion and the concepts of formal leadership being discussed and taught, it was just a natural progression.
Thanks, Graham and Nikki. So we've talked about an evolution here, and it's been driven by companies potentially to be better. Brendan, have you seen during your career in various leadership roles, have you seen an evolution in the way that you've led groups? Like, did you start by doing a lot of research, like I'm going to be a leader, so I need to learn how to be a leader? Or talk us through some of that during your tenure as a leader in various facets.
I would say, admittedly, I really wanted to be the one in charge just because I wanted to be able to choose where I wanted to go. That was a driver for me in my early career. But as I became responsible for developing teams in kind of the director of operations side of things, it's a very different role. I learned from being an expedition leader in the field that, there's certain ways to get to the ends I was trying to achieve. And often that was by thankfully being given very strong team members that I could rely upon and trust. And I always have felt that, giving people the trust to do their jobs properly is a good leadership style that manage where they need to be managed and empower where for the rest of the time. But in developing teams for, a multiple season operation, it's very difficult to kind of put your finger on how to staff those teams and how to assess those skills. And sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. And it could be just personalities are very hard to vet. It may be that the leadership skills and experience of those individuals on paper looks fantastic and it all lines up. But the reality in person, it doesn't work that way. And it can be very, very small things that trigger those challenges. That's, for me, where the PTGA has been a strong resource for me in my roles, that it provides some kind of framework or structure where it was lacking in the earlier days.
So Brando, were you born that way or did you learn that? Are you just a guy because you were born that way?
A little bit of both, probably. I mean, I was young. I was in my early 20s when I first got involved, and there was machismo. There was an interest in having control to make decisions I wanted to make and ambition. But yeah, those things, they seem to fade in the distance as you mature and realize that mistakes can still be made.
Okay, Nikki, why don't we, you had a question or an additive you'd like to put in there?
Yeah, so I was going to add, and I was thinking about this earlier when we were talking about the trait, like developing people, and that when we can talk about leadership or understand it or understand how we interact as a team, it kind of lays a foundation or unlocks the opportunity to also build culture in a really positive and enriching way, and feedback is a really big part of that, and it's something that we've been diving into lots with the team recently. Feedback can be really uncomfortable to give, it can be really uncomfortable to receive, but it's pretty essential to all of us to growth. And so it would be difficult to say, okay, everyone, we're going to provide feedback starting now, and this is how it's going to look. But if you lay some kind of a foundation, a team culture, a sense of trust within the team, a sense of opportunity for growth, or a place where people can thrive, then you can also have better communications around feedback, which is kind of what everyone needs to continue to move into a leadership role. Like at one point, Brandon, you said in the past, your experience was maybe more focused on certain things. I'm assuming maybe you received feedback about that directly, and you kind of course corrected or reflected on that and were able to change and grow. If you hadn't have been open to that, or if there wasn't like an environment in which you could receive it in an effective way, you wouldn't have received it in the same way, and you wouldn't be doing what you're doing now or the way that you do it.
So, Nikki, you've been talking a little bit about feedback and culture within teams. Is this something that you personally have in front of mind when you're leading teams, or is this something that just kind of happens naturally for you?
No, I mean, I think that team culture, there has to be intention put into it. I think it's built from within the team. It's certainly not one person's responsibility. It comes from the collective, but a tone and a vision can be set, or the question of, what we're doing or how we're going to do it. We understand those things, why we're doing it, that could be communicated by a leader on a team. And if people are on board with that and aligned, then it creates this or unlocks the potential of that team and the culture, the positive culture of that team. So no, I think it has to be something that's nurtured and grown. I think people have to feel safe in the environment that they're operating, safe from hazards or from injury, but of course safe to try new things or learn. And so for us, if I speak individually about my style, that's one thing, but generally within our team, we're trying to set a tone of a certain culture of openness, of feedback, of a willingness to provide mentorship or guidance, to leave space for other people to grow and for new people to come on board. I'm not sure if that answers your question or if I just took it in a different direction, but that's kind of what comes to mind.
Graham?
Yeah, and all of the things that I hear Nikki talking about, and I know this from dealing with some colleagues at Quark as well, that really importantly that's tied in there is that Nikki had mentioned the word culture quite a lot, but really crucial and critical to development in this area is also the establishment of some agreed models and a language that people can use so that the rules of engagement are understood. Could you imagine if you came to Ben's Adventures ship, and of course you know how to drive a Zodiac because you now have a qualification and you can lead a hike, you can interpret well, but then you get into the team and your behavior in the team, or someone gives you some feedback in the team and you don't understand what's going on, or you break those rules. And so what I'm seeing also is a lot of different teams establishing rules and boundaries for those things, that communication. This is the model we're going to use for feedback. It doesn't mean there aren't other models for feedback, or that saying this is the best in the world. It's just saying this is the one we've chosen to use. The same with leadership and membership, that we are going to use this model because this gives us a common language, which means that when we're under pressure, which we know is a critical part of operating in polar tourism, which is kind of why we like it as well, that things can be done efficiently and quickly. Because time, as we know, when the hotel manager is saying dinner's in 10 minutes, everybody, but Nikki's trying to resolve a conflict or a excursion that turned totally pear-shaped or something else, if people understand and use the same language, then things can be done so much better. If any sort of career veterans who are listening, I'm sure everybody can reflect on a time when they've had a debrief or which needed some leadership. The rules were unclear, the language is unclear, and it goes round and round in circles. It takes forever and goes on. And I see that as a critical development in the industry and in our leadership.
So Graham, this is actually a question that's been forwarded to me from Penilla. Sounds like a nice person. And it's kind of an question, yeah, on what you and Nikki are talking about there. And the question is, how do leaders such as ELs on board ships manage with solving conflicts within the expedition team, while at the same time having to focus on the next landing and juggle all of that sort of stuff there? How do you find time as a leader to do this? And I think, and I'm leading this a little bit because I can see how this links in with some of the strategies or models we're talking about at the moment.
Yes, you're right, Ben. This was to me, was it? Still?
Yeah, let's just roll.
So yes, I wouldn't offer a particular model of conflict resolution. at this stage or in this forum. But going back to what I said before, in terms of understanding that conflict is going to happen in the finite environment of a polar tourism group, whether you're at a camp in East Greenland or whether you're on a ship on the Antarctic Peninsula, it's inevitable and it's human nature. I find my success as a leader has been in that if the ground rules are laid down ahead of time and everybody understands what they're buying into, when it comes time to resolve a conflict, you have tools in your toolbox which you can pull out and use. So rather than allowing call and response arguments, I did this person said I did this, he said, she said, all of that sort of stuff, which wastes time and achieves nothing, that if people are inducted and are using the rules of a particular culture, whether it's industry-wide or company-wide, it doesn't matter. But if those rules are understood, then it allows the inevitable process of conflict resolution to be carried out much more efficiently. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it can be done more efficiently.
Well, thanks for...
Sorry, Ben. I will not talk for a long time on this one. But one other thing to note is that we're all also, like, expedition leaders are also developing their ability to resolve conflicts or to assist or support those conversations. So there has to be a degree, there really has to be an empathy amongst the team in terms of how we grow together and how we apply those rules. The tools absolutely help, and then we have to provide a buffer of empathy to be able to move through that together, both for our expedition leaders and for a conversation that we might have with our colleague that doesn't require any kind of intervention.
Okay, so there might be a few folks sitting out there at the moment and thinking, oh, maybe I don't work in a team that's as good as I could, and maybe some of these things aren't happening. So what are some actionable steps if you're in a team that's not performing well? What can you do as a staff member to try and ensure that some of these developments happen? Brandon, do you mind taking the mic on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've noted, leadership isn't about title, and it's not about the expedition leader being the leader. Everyone on the team has a responsibility to be a leader, and it comes down to the leadership with the guests, leaderships with the ship team, and there's all sorts of different elements of communication and leadership that go on in an expedition operation like that. I think it's very important that, wherever the team is you work for, and, most companies will have fairly well established operating procedures, or even the culture is very well established. I think it's important that, everybody's on the same page of what the achievable goals are and how they're done safely and how you get around to it. And then having space for discussion. It's very easy to say, this is what we've always done. I had a great example leading a trip, and I had a great team, very experienced team, I thought. And we had a new person come aboard from a different industry. It was a mountaineer guide, but there was a photographer on our team. And we got called out on how we were operating in Eco Harbor. It was just astonishing to this person that we would do what we were doing in that scenario. And it was really boilerplate stuff as far as my experience, and I'm sure a lot of people here. But this person was very uncomfortable with what he was seeing. And it was very quick for some of the team to not provide that acknowledgement that there could be a different view on that. So I guess, it's understanding that there's strengths and different opinions within a team. And even though there may be established norms, that there needs to be continued evaluation of what it is you're doing, and not to assume that you're doing it the right way, even after all these years of us operating.
Okay, and then a question on my lips, and maybe the lips of many as they seek to make themselves better. We've talked about leadership, and we've talked about trust, and some ideas and concepts. How does one go about learning these and improving their skills? Do you need to get hired by the right company? Is this something that you could take on your own? Graham, I'll pass this to you, and then maybe Nikki, you can take it from there.
The question? Where do I learn leadership?
Yeah, so if somebody wants to, now
I'm just taking the mickey. like we might expect someone to improve their knowledge of flora and fauna in the polar regions that they're working in, I think in the contemporary age and as a professional guide, it's incumbent on people to upskill themselves on other parts of this job, the meta skills, if you like. So in terms of leadership, where can you do that? Of course, you can go online and look at it and read up and stuff, but obviously talking to your peers when you sign on with a company, asking what are the rules of engagement if an induction is not immediately forthcoming. I think that stuff's important. If you're a PTGA member and you haven't discovered it, we have our virtual learning environment course, which has basically a leadership 101 and 201 course, which introduces a couple of, or not more than a couple, introduces a few models of communication and leadership, which you will likely see if you work for a number of companies in the polar tourism industry. And we have those there. It's a very short program, but it gets people going along the right path and at least speaking a similar language of Tuckman's team development, of the idea of contingency leadership, which is, I believe, of all of the models, leadership models that I work with professional business schools, that contingency leadership models are the most suited to the nature of polar tourism industry. Contingency being, it's contingent on what's going on. It's situational. It means that leadership and or membership is contingent on what's happening, because unlike a job in an office where the parameters that may change are relatively limited, we know the fun and boisterousness of working in the polar regions. We can have a great plan, or as a famous quote of going into battle, the plan's fantastic until the first shot is fired. And think of an excursion as that first shot. Brandon, with his nature, he may not have learned this, but by nature, he might be a good leader. He has a great plan to go on this excursion. The moment the excursion gets underway, things start changing. The weather changes. A whale pops up over there and sends everyone over there. A polar bear clears the beach over here. That leader needs to have a number of contingencies up their sleeve, but also the members or the membership of that team need to understand what membership is about and how they fit into that role. Whether they have expertise even beyond Brandon in that scenario doesn't matter. They're still a member, and that has a different role to play. And so by searching on the web, doing our VLE course, or talking with your peers who have expertise in this, then that's where a new guide or someone who's interested in getting better at leadership needs to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I absolutely agree with all of that. And a few things that I would add, around developing your own skills. I think if we are assessing, how, if a leadership style is working, or if it's, we can look at how do you feel within the team? Are you thriving within the team, and do you have an opportunity to be growing? Is your team thriving together? Is that working? And so I think great leaders can also create those opportunities within their teams, like Brandon said earlier, to move into and take on higher leadership roles. It doesn't have to be a title associated with it, but a senior staff member, or even not even a senior staff member, a staff member who's confident and observant and has some experience, can provide mentorship to their peers, and that's leadership, providing that mentorship. And so I think there's opportunities in terms of developing as a leader, acknowledging that there isn't only one leader on the team. There isn't, you don't have to be an expedition leader to be the only leader there. And accepting and taking on the challenges of those other roles can really, I think, enrich your ability to develop as a leader. Graham, you have something to add?
Yeah, I just to clarify, it's not just about the positional power of expedition leader, that if you are in charge of the 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 bio cleaning station on the ship, and you have 3 other staff members working for you, you are a leader. And so you can practice all of that stuff that higher level positional power is doing by just being a leader in the mudroom cleaning boots, or a leader in charge of your 2 people on a hike. You are the leader, and that's a great way to start practicing formal leadership skills. And the best way to find out how you did, of course, is to have a communication process with the people who you are leading, where they can give you some feedback and say, yeah, you sucked, or this was really good, or this is what happened and this is how you might improve.
Yeah, I think like ultimately in a leadership in any leadership role, but as an expedition leader, you ideally that person is humble and acknowledges that there's always more to learn as well. And so in accepting that humility, then it's also okay for someone who has the capacity to lead an expedition to take on a different role within the team, or rather, don't leave your responsibilities of expedition leader to take on other roles. But I mean, you may feel that it's your time is now, and you want that position and your eye is on that. But there's a humility and an acknowledgement of your own development in accepting and owning and being a leader in those ways that Graham is describing.
Yep. And I want to throw it out there to Ben Jackson. I know for sure that Ben Jackson gets some fairly good rave reviews as an expedition leader who builds a really productive team who are sort of focused on goals, all of that stuff, a great influencer, an influence process. What do you think, Ben?
Oh, the table has turned. Thanks, Graham. Somebody, when I was first looking at becoming an expedition leader, I was certainly inspired by some of the people I worked with, and Brando was one of them early on in my career. And we both had a lot more hair then. And then, that kind of opened my eyes to wanting to become an EL or move into a leadership role. And so I had a chat with some people that I admired, and some of the advice I got about expedition leading was, if you want to do a good job as EL, then you need to look after your team. And that started to send me down the rabbit hole of, okay, so how does one look after one's team, in a leadership capacity? And that's become, something that it's almost my go-to thing. It underscores everything I'm looking at doing in a leadership role, is looking after the team that I work for, because if they're happy and content in their role most of the time, or if not all of the time, then they're going to do a good job. And that's going to link back to what I think Graham was talking about earlier. Ultimately, we're looking at delivering the ultimate, double ultimates there, passenger experience. And to do that, we need to have a happy team. And then that led me down the rabbit hole. So how do you keep somebody motivated? Because as we see in expedition teams, we have a good spread. And initially it was a little intimidating to work with somebody who's been in the field for 20 years and has, done literally thousands of days as an EL or, as a staff member. How do I step in as the young buck and, take that over? And so your motivation started to become something I looked into, and that was something that I worked on a lot in self-development. There's actually a really good book called Legacy, written about the All Blacks, that talks about leadership and teams and things like that. So if you want to put something on your reading list, and if you like rugby and you want to learn a little bit about New Zealand culture, then Legacy is a good option. There we go. That was a moderately long-winded answer for you there, Graham. So something we've talked about is teams can have the capacity for different leaders in them. How can we work well as a collective or as a team when we have a bunch of different leaders in them? Brando, any experience with different leaders and different roles or facets with your time with any of the operations you've been involved in?
Back to your point about happy teams, I mean, it's an old adage, and it's corny as it sounds. It is true that, a happy team, a team that seem to be friends, as it were, are going to be producing the best product. For me, as a leader, I I'm very, very happy to lean on the team around me to do their jobs and do them well. And I've always found that when left to their own devices, most people will not only meet your expectations, but exceed them. And those things are really evident when things are going sideways, when, you know, everything you've planned for as a team and everyone's on the same page about it, those things go sideways. It's that trust in each other, knowing that, you know, this is going to be okay because that person's got my back, that these people aren't out for themselves. They're not out to raise their own status or be the hero, that, you know, everyone understands that this is about each other and getting ourselves back safely and you know, in a good time. Yeah, it's the examples of bad leadership are those scenarios where, you know, you could have the most experienced team in the world, and when people are being constantly called on the radio and reminded that there's 10 minutes left before the last Zodiac, things like this, the demoralizing effect on that and the long-term motivation will disappear very quickly, as you've mentioned, Ben. It's how do you keep those people engaged? How do you give them ownership of what they're doing and kind of ownership of some of the praise and the result that you've achieved? It's all very important part of it for me, is really making sure that people buy into us as a collective producing something for valued guests.
Great, thanks, Brando. I just had a question pop up that's been passed on from Lauren, and Phil asks, ELs often serve as the conduit between the office and the ship. What are some effective ways you've found as expedition leaders, I'm paraphrasing a little here, in resolving conflicts of interest between the office and expedition teams and expedition leaders? Anybody have any experience where you're dealing with different ideals there? I think we probably all have.
I'll try to tackle that one. One, as I make a transition from the field into the office, and that's been happening kind of gradually over a few years with contract work. I realized that we don't always speak the same language, and we don't always maybe empathize for the realities of the other. So folks in the office, if they haven't had a lot of time in the field, a lot of contact with the field, an understanding of what expedition team members do day in and day out, year after year, they may have expectations of that team that aren't realistic. And then if the expedition team isn't connected to the office and the workflow there and the objectives that people have and all of the different intricate parts of making things happen behind the scenes, then there's a real disconnect. We not speaking the same language at all. And so I think within our organization, I think one thing that has alleviated any misunderstandings are opportunities for those two to come together. So expedition leader summits, a couple of meetings each year where office folks can come together with expedition leaders and discuss and share challenges from the field and troubleshoot them together and try to understand each other's perspective and realities. But I also think it takes quite an effort. It should take an effort from the office and from the leadership at the office to engage with the field and reach out and be present and be physically there with the team and alongside expedition team members understand what it is that they do on a daily basis. I think that goes a really long way. I have an anecdote that I'd be happy to share about that, but I'm happy to hand over to Graham on that one.
Yeah, just to add to that, so, the work that I do teaching leadership out in the retail world and at business school level, it doesn't matter whether you're a Fortune 500 company or a small polar tourism company. If the people in the field, the people at the coalface, are working to one set of rules and they're starting to develop their culture, they're needing leadership in that, in everything that they do. If the office or the bigger administrative side of that doesn't speak the same language, then as Nikki said, you have that disconnect and there will be tension and conflict. So the work I do with companies who want their expedition teams trained in leadership and communication skills, one of the very first disclosures I make to any executive or ops people that I deal with is, yes, we can do this. We can talk about leadership and the staff will go away going, oh my God, I learned these great things. But if you don't if you don't disseminate that and work with that transition zone of office and field staff, then it's only partially successful. It has to happen. That's the next development.
Thanks, Graham and Nikki. And we'll take this as our last question on leadership, and we could go all night on this one, but we deserve to spend a little bit of time on safety management. So a question from Ross. Any comments from the panelists on styles of leadership in relation to the size of the teams that they work with? I have paraphrased you there, Ross. I do hope that's okay. Brando, you've worked with big teams and probably quite small teams at EOS. Do you see a need in a different style of leadership, or is it something that can be applicable to all?
Yeah, I think it's it doesn't really matter how big the team is. I mean, in EOS's model, we sometimes have just Graham on a boat with clients, but in those scenarios, you know, a single guide, you know, they're pretty much everything. They're the naturalist, the kayak guide, and the expedition leader all wrapped in one. Their leadership and team building is basically didn't transfer to managing client expectations and safety, working with a crew that are often not found to have had any experience in the regions we're operating. We really are kind of helping them succeed at their goals. And of course, the yacht succeeding at being the platform and the client getting what they want out of it. But we also run ships where we have the world, where we have 200, 300 guests and residents, and we have teams of 25 or 30 staff. And obviously, the more people you have involved in the team, the more complexity, the more personality. And so, again, for me, it's and it kind of comes back to the standards and the culture that the company and the office portray to the guides. And as often as possible in my role in the office, of course, it's nice to have a non-moving bed to sleep in most of the year now. It's very important to have your finger on the pulse of what the teams in the field need. And it's easy to forget the difficulties of working long seasons or being on boats and dealing with all these challenges. So, a big thing is to really ensure that everybody understands kind of the goals and they have ownership of that. And I find the most effective way for teams to be productive is to make sure they all feel like they have a voice, and that voice has to be heard. It has to be acknowledged. Necessarily has to be addressed. I mean, there's a lot of times people will bring concerns and they maybe have been dealt with, or they're already handled in formal policies or expectations within those teams. But it's really important, I think, no matter what size the team, that everybody has a voice. Everybody feels like they can be open about their fears and their strengths. And I think that's where you're going to have the most success with the team.
Ben, I'll jump in there. In terms of the theoretical science of leadership, it doesn't distinguish between a 2-person team and a 100-person team. Again, the work that I do in academia in that area, it's the same thing. If you have a team, if it was Brando, Nikki, and I off on an expedition, one of us has positional power. If that person outlines a framework of what this is, a communication method to have flow of information backwards and forwards, that we have empathy in that team, and that we all understand the rules of engagement, then those are principles. And I might, or Brando might, or Nikki might use exactly the same stuff, whether they're suddenly given a team of 50 aboard the World or some other bigger ship, or just a normal job out in the world. It shouldn't matter. If they're close to principles, then it doesn't matter whether the team's 2 or 50, in my opinion.
I think as well, like we depends, I guess, on how we're defining leadership styles, whether it's leadership like models or how we are interacting with individual people. But I think a different style kind of has to be applied to every team member. So it doesn't matter the size of the team, but each team member is deserving of an individual approach to their to their place within the team. A newer staff member may require more support, more check-ins, more questions or prompts. Whereas if you were to treat a more senior staff member in that way, or be overbearing, or follow up on things constantly and not provide that autonomy, that same style, the same application of of leadership wouldn't work for each of those people. So you could have 30 different people and maybe not 30 different styles, but each of those are going to require, each person needs, we're all individuals after all, and needs an individual approach to creating a space for them to thrive.
Yep, and I'll just finish that off very quickly. A very common phrase or maxim in the leadership training world goes, different strokes for different folks and different strokes for the same folks, which means that if I'm leading Ben Jackson in an activity, and how I would be a leader to Ben for Zodiac driving will differ completely to how I might lead Ben if I were to be teaching him about ice climbing, for instance, where Ben has no skills, whereas Zodiac driving, he has lots of skills. I change my leadership contingent on the team member.
Wahoo. Well, thanks for that. That was a nice bit of dialogue there. And I think for current and aspiring leaders, in whatever capacity you may be in, there is hopefully some nuggets, as we call them, in there. Some of the key themes, I guess, I can draw from that. Sounds like communication is key, as is building trust, and that a lot of that comes down to the culture within the team, and then also ensuring that you have the rules of engagement set. There we go. That's a way to paraphrase an hour's conversation. So what I'd like to do now is just shift focus slightly and head into the safety management side of things, because this is really another key aspect of actually being a leader, but also an effective professional in the polar regions, or even just the expedition industry at large. So what I'd like to do is first question on this here is around safety management, and what are some of the tools that you use? And this kind of is a nice transition for us, because as expedition leaders or assistant expedition leaders, we do utilize a set of tools to help manage safety. Graham, you had the mic. Do you want to continue with that one?
Okay, this is something that I've been interested in through my whole adult career, as to why people make the decisions they do, and then been able to dissect those decisions and figure out where they are. A guy called Micah Ensley, I think, has the most useful definition of situational awareness that I use on a lot of training courses, and I apologize to people who know this from my training. But Micah says that the perception of elements in the environment within a volume of time and space, well, this is what situational awareness is, the comprehension of their meaning, and this is the crux, the most important bit, the projection of their status in the near future. Let me just dissect that for you. A definition of situational awareness, which is kind of a buzzword in the polar tourism industry, I've found. The perception of elements in the environment within a volume of time and space. So that's you simply looking off the side of the ship, looking at what's on your feet on your hike, feeling the water underneath your Zodiac, understanding what the polar bear is doing. So that's fine. Most people can come into the industry and learn relatively quickly that that is a required skill. The tricky part is the last bit, the comprehension of their meaning and the projection of their status in the near future. So that goes to everything from, what is this wind getting better or worse? What am I going to do about it? I've had someone slip over on my hike and I'm on my own. What am I going to do about it? Is this going to get better or worse? Think of our polar bear panels, understanding, what is this polar bear doing relative to our group? What do I choose to do about it within the tools that I have? And how's this going to shape out this decision making into the future, so far into the future that I'm even concerned about what a coroner might say if I get this niche projection wrong. And to me, that's a really important part. We talk about situational management. If you understand situational awareness, any resulting action from my previous definition then becomes your management of the situation, and that's what you get to review. How's that?
Substantial. Thanks for that, Graham. Nikki or Brando, what tools do you consider when you're in that expedition leader role, or even just an expedition staff member? What are some of the tools that you utilize out in the field with safety management?
Well, one practical tool or method, or I mean, it doesn't have to be one, but using, so Graham, of course, hit the nail on the head there. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you make sure that you do that? How do you know? You may not be aware of risks, or aware or experienced enough to understand the environment or the situation that you're in, and or you do very well, and you make some shortcuts with your brain, and you don't necessarily assess or apply the right decision in that scenario. And so I think a really key thing is to create or use, or within our team, we use a WETAP, a structure, but a checklist that prompts a team member to assess the conditions every time they go through that. And it's a moment, it's a pause, it's a breath, but it forces even the most experienced expedition team member to pause and observe and think about what could be coming next. And there are different models, but we're looking at weather and sea state, the people that we're traveling with, their abilities, the terrain, the equipment that we have on hand, and the activity that you're doing. So that's a WETAP. That's a checklist that our team applies to that assessment, and that's something that's being worked into how people are training and learning to guide, but it's something to adjust to as well. It's new to people, but it provides like an anchor. So even though all of these things are changing around us and our mind can make shortcuts because we've been here before and we know what the conditions could be like, it forces us to go through that checklist and analyze carefully, albeit efficiently if you have a lot of experience, and be sure that you're not being complacent in an environment that you might be comfortable in.
Okay. So that actually feels like quite an actionable step there. Thanks, Nikki. So having a checklist available, is this something that your teams have written down, or is it something that they memorize? How do they go about keeping the information?
So for us, that was created as part of the curriculum, but it's not a concept that it's one that came out of our colleagues in New Zealand who were involved in developing the curriculum. But we've actually created a physical waterproof card that goes in a waterproof right in the rain. And so as new staff are trained, they become more familiar with using that, and then they have it on hand. In the same way that someone may do the same thing, intuitively by going to the bridge before an excursion, and understanding the wind direction or the plans for the excursion, the amount of time. This just creates a formal process and a physical checklist that is provided to the team. Albeit you could create your own, absolutely, just with those concepts and those prompts, basically.
To me, that stuff, again, to go back to put it in really simple language, it's a framework, and it gives your entire team the same language to talk about the stuff. So it gives everybody a psychologically safe environment to do that, and WETAP makes a great model. I also would like to share that I, in my position where lots of guides from north and south, land and sea, get in touch with me to talk about near misses and incidents, what I will say is that any of these large group Zodiac driving near incidents that come over my desk, going back to the causal factors, the inability for people to speak up and have a way to discuss how they feel about it in a healthy and safe way is always present in every one of those. And something like WETAP, front of mind, which means that if any of you, or I hope you're members, and you get our wonderful newsletter, Brash Talk, the last issue of Brash Talk, and our particular column called Guano Happens, was an absolutely perfect example of what's called groupthink. where Zodiacs are out there doing that. Everyone's thinking that someone else is thinking the same thing, and who's taking charge of this or who's saying it, with no fixed agreed language to talk in. Where if that group had that, they could have very quickly decided, this really isn't such a good idea. And so WETAP or some other version of agreed communication methodology is super important for team safety management.
And I think the use of a tool like that is, of course, really effective for someone who has experience in that environment, or has had incidents from which they've learned things. But what about new people who, for them, it's the first time in the Arctic or Antarctica? How do you move through that? There is a certain degree of, your own personal evolution and your understanding of the environment. And so the other ways I think that we can learn from that is to not necessarily do that alone. You don't have to do that checklist on your own. You can drive over to someone else and touch base with them and go through it together. And you might catch some, even if you're experienced staff members, you might catch something that the other person hasn't seen. And then to build on that, it's less proactive. But if an incident does occur, I mean, we are going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Then the process by which we reflect on that and discuss it, we all can learn a lot from. So it doesn't have to be only that person got caught in the moving sea ice, and that person learned, well, now they're much better at dealing with sea ice in the future. No, there's actually a lot of learnings and reflection that the whole team can take from that if the incident is debriefed in that way. And in that way, or rather, that requires a safety culture that's open. That requires our team not to hold back on if you smoke a rock in a bay and just damage your prop. You could put your boat back on the hook and say nothing about it, or you could chat with the team and communicate and let people know that there's a rock out there, and unfortunately you hit it, but this is how everybody can learn from the mistakes that we're making. So there's a combination of like proactive checklists and prompts, and then there's a culture of openness, similar to that what we were talking about with leadership, that we need to build in order to learn from that. We can't learn from incidents if we hide them, certainly.
I just jump in and I fully agree with both assessments. And the best, and a lot of times there's not going to be a need for maybe a full discussion about the safety of an activity on a bluebird day and the weather stable and all the rest of it, but it's when those decisions are less than black and white, especially as a leader yourself, having the trust in your team and be able to read the room and read their feelings and input, and whether or not that is the right thing to do, and whether that's got structure or not. I think that having that voice and having the value in the decision making, even though their overall decision may not agree with those feelings of that individual, is really important. From my end, it's especially with the complexity of some of the operations we conduct with EOS, with submersibles and helicopters, and I know many other operators are wading into these complexities as well. The value more and more for me in position of slotting guides and expedition leaders is their competence with all the reams and reams of guidelines, regulations, and rules. I mean, that's fundamentally what's really important at the end of the day, that I can know sitting in the office that I'm confident that that person is going to make the right decisions based on what the expectations are of the permit conditions as the operator of record. That expedition leader has done their due diligence and they know all the regulations for our competent authority country, for IATO, for the ATCM if it's Antarctica, or the Sysselman for Svalbard, for example. The complexity of operations nowadays is not that just anybody can go down there. It's very, very administrated. And so the leadership of a trip really does come down to that kind of administrative knowledge. And I'd hope that those leaders are going to take full advantage of the scope of people that we've placed around them. We've taken great care usually to build teams so that there are complementary skill sets and complementary knowledge, and that when things are less than clear, that expedition leader or the leaders within that team are going to have a dialogue together to be able to make those decisions as a collective. That is not one person. fundamentally, that one person is going to have to answer to the decisions that were made, though, and that is kind of the reality of being an expedition leader.
Yeah, and I'll jump in again. The something that Nikki had brought up was about Nikki used the word reflection a lot, which probably speaks to your character, Nikki, and empathy. I can see why you're famous in your roles. Really important in there too, I believe, and if there's any company owners here, I will feel their sphincters tighten up very shortly, is that the sharing of that information, to not share that across the broader guide group, I think is a travesty. To have a near miss or an incident in safety management within a company and not be able to share what happened and how we can get better at it is an opportunity missed. And for anybody who understands theoretical risk management, we all understand that it's a triangle, and at the base of that triangle is an awful lot of near misses, a lot of them. That person who fell over, nothing happened, they were just embarrassed. The day that you just missed because you left Iceberg Alley and then 60 seconds behind you the whole thing fell down where you were, nothing happened. It's no big deal, but it was a near miss. And to not acknowledge that, on top of the next layer up in that triangle are some incidents where something does happen. And then if sharing and reporting are not done in this part of the triangle, then up here is where we get to fatalities, because information hasn't been passed on about a particular thing or a particular behavior. And that's critical. And I believe that that's a development which is waiting in the wings for our industry, is to crack how we share that information amongst guides without with anonymity, without a blame culture, and to all fully understand that, as Nikki said at the start, we're all going to make mistakes. It's the nature of operating in a non-standard environment. Brando talked about standard operating procedures. One of the reasons I work in the polar regions is because standard operating procedures generally go out the door the moment the first puff of a pressure wind comes off Gold Harbor, or you walk into an icy patch on a snow hike, or whales pop up underneath you. All of those standard operating procedures go out the window. We're now dealing with situational management. How does one learn situational awareness? To me, the key, rather than having any set rules, is that you need a communication system. The only way to get better at situational awareness is to try, fail, or get things not quite right, but have a mentor or other peers who can give you honest feedback in a safe environment. And that's really the only, it's the only way to go about it. You can read lots of books, but until you try and receive feedback in the context of your operating, that's where people need to get that from.
So Graham, I'm just going to touch on what you talked about there, not about the sphincter tightening, but more, you mentioned that the industry at some stage in the future needs to have a way of sharing these near misses or the base of the triangle. And I can appreciate that you're all stakeholders here with various companies or businesses or entities, but as experienced polar folk such as yourselves, how do you think the industry needs to go about this? What are some actionable steps for us from here? How does this happen?
I can only speak to, because of my role at PTGA, encouraging guides to talk to each other in a culture of no blame, and with that anonymity, to share stuff with us, knowing that you're sharing for development as opposed to trying to attribute blame. I mean, I'm sure Nikki and Brando and any senior experienced guide out there knows that there is no way, when you read it or hear in the rumor mill in Ushuaia or Longyearbyen that someone got away with a close call. I don't know any of my peers who will go, yeah, that was a dumbass move, I'd never do that, because we all know how weird this environment is and that it could happen to us on another day, which is why that doesn't happen. And so, it needs to come from that culture. And I believe in this early stage, because of fear of litigation, from at company level, guides themselves have a really, really good opportunity at the moment to be able to embrace that open sharing through, a common thread like the PTGA or a newsletter or whatever other groups people are part of.
So Nikki and Brando, you're obviously both large stakeholders in your own businesses or companies rather. Is there a way that this can happen in-house as well? Is there a culture of sharing, and can this be grown internally and then expand into the industry? Is this something that's currently happening or something that is on the radar for the future? Nikki?
Yeah, that's a really nice segue. I think it ultimately has to begin within our companies or amongst guides. If there isn't an open culture to share it within our own companies, then there most definitely wouldn't be amongst the industry, right? So as we, I can speak from our experience and the development of resources over the last year or so that are helping guide the team, capture near misses, share hazards, compose incident reports in a way that's more uniform, and then analyzing those, and then being able to share them back to the team and to expedition leaders, so that the team understands what's happening out there across the fleet and learning from that. And so that's maybe on a smaller, more company level, but that's certainly that kind of learning, or that database, or that sharing without competition across the industry is likely where we need to go with this. I think each company is hopefully working independently and improving their systems and culture, but it does start with the openness that is required, and then resources or templates and education about what it is, like what are we capturing, what is a near miss. Near misses, a slip and a fall is a near miss, and sometimes because people take tumbles on the ice or on the snow, we assume that that's just part of operations, but that's a problem. That person could have injured themselves or their things, or so there's I would say there's a greater education about about how we capture safety information from the field, incidents, an openness to discuss it, not a fear and a desire to hide information for fear of being called out or losing your job or something like that. Those things internally definitely need to happen. I think they are for us. That's something that we've been working really hard on. One of my colleagues, Cam Walker, really hard over the last year, and I hope that then we can feed into and be involved in something more collaborative across the industry, which I would say there is some sharing of information. I wouldn't say there's none. Certainly, I'm interested to know if sharing of for instance, crevasses or hazards in the field is something that all of you have seen more recently, or but maybe I'll leave it to Brandon first.
From an operator perspective, I fully understand the need for secrecy and privacy and control of information flow. I mean, we are bound to what we say we're going to do, and when there is a crack in the planning, and if there is a weakness, then it doesn't reflect well when you're trying to tell a permitting authority that you're going to do this way and this is how safe you are. I would say, and I throw this to the participants, all the people listening in, I have many times provided conduits for feedback for incident reports, and I can count on one hand the amount of incident reports I've received in the last decade. I mean, it's a tool. I've provided an anonymous channel to provide feedback. I've hoped that I could feed that back into the teams and we could all learn from those mistakes. But obviously, as a manager in an office, you can only deal with the things that you have solid information on. And if it's a rumor mill or something, I mean, who knows the truth of any of those reports from the dock in Ushuaia? And so, I encourage everybody, if your operator does have these mechanisms, to take full advantage of them. Ideally, in the long term, the industry, whether it be through very similar models as, mountain guiding, where you have an annual report of, all the different things so we can all learn from it. If that evolves in time, that'd be fantastic. But at the very least, we hope that if I'm learning something in my position and I take that to the membership of IADO or IACO, and, we share something as a membership, that will influence safety overall and how teams are managed and empowered. I know from especially the field staff conferences we've had over the last few years, we've had people able to openly discuss incidences they've had, and I've gone back and I've directly changed how we operate in the companies I'm running because of things I've learned from that sharing, whether it be a change to the shore kit or something I've added to the Zodiacs or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, take full advantage of those mechanisms if they do exist within your operations, because as a administrator, I can only use what I have in front of me, and if I don't have it, it's not going to be very valuable.
Yep, and from the PTGA newsletter, our Guano Happens thing, from the our column, from our membership survey that we did over a year ago, it was the #1 thing that people wanted to read in that newsletter. They wanted to read, not because of a macabre fascination with who had screwed up, but because as a professional, they knew that any of these things could happen to them. If it's already happened to someone else, they would like to learn from that rather than learn out in the field.
Thanks a lot to all of you. Actually, there's some good information there, and I certainly, I can echo what you've all said here. I do believe, in the interest of the expedition industry, that it's in our best interest to try and ensure that we open these channels up and create a dialogue and learn from each other. In my time, and I work in a fly cruise operation, so I don't get support that often in the Antarctic season, and then in the Arctic, you're at sea for 10 days at a time, so you tend not to catch up with people much. But just the quick discussions I've had along the way, it's in port, there's so many little nuggets that come out, and there's so many good learning opportunities that happen just by chatting with guides as you walk into town together. So I can only imagine the benefit that could come once we collectively start to, collate and learn from all of these incidences and accidents. Now, we're still ticking along time-wise here, so we'll look at trying to wrap things up. Just something, and again, we're not going to do it justice because we simply don't have the time, but if you do a quick Google of leadership and leadership styles and methods and approaches and all of this sort of stuff, and it leads itself, over, pun unintended, to safety management, something that you'll find pretty quickly is heuristic traps or something that pop up, and we may or may not be aware of these, but I thought it would be a good opportunity for some of the panel to elaborate on this if they would like, if anything, but just to put it on the radar of some of those aspiring polar guides or people who are new to the industry. Anyone care to take this? I'll have to delegate to the center of my screen. Graham Charles, you made eye contact. Over to you, buddy.
It's an interesting thing because I'm in a discussion with an academic friend of mine who lectures on this at a university, and the veracity of the whole heuristic paradigm is coming under question. So, sorry, Ben, you might have screwed up there. If you're unsure of where or what a heuristic is or where Ben was going to, heuristics are basically shortcut maxims or rules that we might follow to aid complex decision making. So, for instance, if you're trying to decide whether you're going to drive into that iceberg alleyway there on your own, then rather than spending half an hour running a risk analysis of the whole thing, there's probably some simple heuristics that you are going to apply to the situation to aid that whole process. What Ben's referring to in terms of heuristic traps are in a lot of causal analysis of incidents. Researchers and or investigators find that there are some common heuristic traps or common reasons why people have got themselves into the situation that they're in, and if you're a developing guide or even a guide an experienced guide who doesn't know about this stuff, it's worth having in your arsenal as a development process. And as Ben said, you can Google it rather than me prattling on right now. But I believe that they, regardless of their veracity in contemporary academia, I still think they have a place for that common language discussion that we had talked about so much with the panel. That was all I had.
You're still on mute, Ben.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, technology. I was just saying, thanks a lot for that, Grum. Does anybody care to add to that, or are we happy just to move into our closing statements? Okay, there we have it. So a question, and I'll actually open this up and we'll hear from all of you. We've actually had, I think, a lot of good takeaways this evening, and hopefully people have been quickly scribbling down little notes and ideas and the like as we move through. But just from each of you, you know, your advice to anyone who's wanting to move on in their own personal leadership role, and if you really feel like it, you can add a little what some of us would refer to as a nugget or of how to improve safety management out there. So just two little takeaways before we start to wrap things up for the session here. Nikki, anything you care to impart on the team here?
Sure. So one is that I thought of earlier, and I wanted to share it in terms of a resource, something that, again, my aforementioned colleague Cam Walker has introduced to our team is a person, and his concepts is Simon Sinek. Something that if you haven't listened to as a podcast or read about, there's a lot of nuggets in there, and it's something that's really guiding how we're talking about leadership amongst our team right now. And so that would be maybe a resource nugget that I'd share with you. As for the leadership role, I think I would kind of revert to what I said before, and that is acknowledging that within a team there are different ways to be a leader. And if you look for those ways, if you have the opportunity to be within a team that you can thrive in those different leadership roles within a team, or you look for those, or you lean into them if they present themselves to you, that those are ways that you evolve and move forward, and perhaps move forward to the end goal, if that is your end goal, into being an expedition leader. Or maybe it's to be the lead of a kayak program or an AEL, or to run a training program. And so being open to that and recognizing that there's different opportunities, and to take those, seize those. Hopefully the autonomy is there for you as you grow into that role. I think that would be my advice on leadership growth. Am I also talking about safety management, or do you want to hear from someone else? Maybe we'll pass over to whoever's next.
I would echo, as advice in being a leader in a team. I think there are all sorts of ways to be a leader in a team. And I think, the best teams are full of leaders. The leaders are every single person is taking a leadership role in their own way and adding value with the strengths they have. Some of the best leaders I've seen on expeditions are the people that are really, really dialed into the tone of the passengers' feelings about things, where it's very easy to be delivery focused as maybe an operations side of thing, but those people that are really understanding the tone of the passengers, or maybe seeing an anxiety or a fear in somebody, that leadership is not to be undervalued. And so you can step into those roles by identifying your strengths and adding value to the overall goals of the expedition in that way. And I would second Simon as being a good inspiration for leadership stuff. I think fundamentally what I've taken away from Simon Sinek is, people want to have a leader they can trust is going to basically put their life down for them, that, they're not the person in charge, but they're the person that they want to follow into battle. And so, it doesn't have to be a title thing. It can just be that you stand out as somebody that everyone can trust, and those people around you, your team, your crew, they all know that, you'll put them first over themselves.
From me, I'll do my two. One thing I hadn't touched on, and I'd meant to early on, and I apologize if suddenly people go, aha, yes. In terms of a first step to developing leadership, is absolutely critical that you identify what your personal leadership style is, what you naturally go to with no training, no whatever. Are you a directive person? Are you a collaborator? To understand yourself before you then go on to learn, okay, this is what I do naturally. How can I then build the rest of what leadership is around me to get better myself? So that's a critical first step, whether it's using a model or whether you're just doing your own homework at home. Simon Sinek, yes, I think they are statistically some of the most watched YouTube clips on the planet. If anyone who knows that, if you don't in your sleep say people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, then that's a maxim, and it's in there. And I would also throw out Simon Sinek if you were looking at develop presentation skills, to observe what he does, because he is he's a role model with so many different techniques and presentation skills. In terms of safety management, my nugget would be, don't stop asking questions and don't be afraid to ask questions. If you see anyone in your team who has the ability to provide you with some feedback, you've led a hike and you've done this thing lots of times, but suddenly here's a mountain guide in your midst, or someone who has a lot of good experience with this, just go to them and say, hey, Brando, this happened to me today while I was out driving my Zodiac. This is what I did. What do you think? And have those discussions. That's how you change that situational awareness to a development of situational management. And it's the only tool I can think of that we have without, very fast internet lecture theaters and all the rest of it, is to go to your peers or known experts, give them examples, hit them with scenarios, and even better, if it's something that happened to you. Here was a decision I made. What do you think?
Would you like, I'll add a nugget, a safety management nugget. We did talk about it before, but I really think that the openness is really key. Being open with information you have, with learnings, not to be afraid to share your own weakness or your own error or mistake or misjudgment with your peers, whether that's on your team or with the wider industry of peers that we all are. Because we can't possibly live every experience or every incident or near miss, and we can learn a lot from the people who are encountering those. So if we continue to be open and share that amongst our teams and hopefully into the future in the industry, then on safety we'll be much better as a collective.
Great. Well, pretty much concludes everything we were hoping to work through in the time that we had. So first of all, thank you to everyone who has taken the time out to attend the live viewing of the session here. We certainly appreciate your time and the time that you've invested in this. And then very much from me, a big thank you to Nikki, Graham and Brandon for taking time out of their very busy schedules at the moment, because life does go on, even though some of us are time rich at the moment. So I do appreciate the three of you taking time out of your busy lives, not just for this session here, but there's actually a lot of work that goes into putting all of these polar panels together. So I do look forward to sharing a beer or a cocktail with you all at some stage and reflecting upon this. And I think on behalf of everyone who's tuned into this now, or the stuff that will get uploaded through the PTGA website, for those who couldn't attend, thank you very much for sharing your insights, some of your hard-learned knowledge, and perhaps a few nuggets along the way. Behind the scenes, hidden behind a logo at the moment, thank you very much to Lauren. She's been an integral person in the process here, who's kind of been the glue that's brought a lot of this together. And then our pioneering moderator, Doug, led the way for us there. And then, of course, Colby last time. So big thanks to the team there. We have had quite a few resources that have been referenced to So what we'll do as the PTGA at some point in the very near future, we'll add some of the references that have been spoken about from this session here on the Polar Guides group on Facebook. So if you're not a member of that, then we'll look at adding that up there shortly. And then if you do want to learn a little bit more about the Polar Tourism Guides Association, then certainly head over to polartourismguides.com and then you can learn a little bit more about things. But other than that, it's been fantastic. The 5-part Polar Panel sessions, we do appreciate all of the input from all of the panelists and all of the questions that you've put in as viewers. We do appreciate that as well. And we hope you're happy and well, and everyone's healthy in your neck of the woods, as we would say. And hopefully we see you sometime somewhere in a port nearby. So until next time, have a good morning, good evening, or good night, and thank you very much.